Use headphones for best experience.
Maggie Harper and her husband Tom sat down to a quiet dinner with their two children, 13-year-old Jake and 9-year-old Emily, in their old farmhouse on the outskirts of the sleepy town of Millbrook. Outside, an autumn wind howled, rattling the windows and scraping tree branches against the clapboard walls. Inside, the family chatted softly about school and chores, enjoying the warmth of roast chicken and potatoes. It felt like an ordinary, peaceful evening. A faint floorboard creak from the darkened living room made Tom pause, fork halfway to his mouth. He held up a hand for silence. The family fell still, listening. Another creak, closer this time, just beyond the doorway to the dining room. Maggie's pulse quickened. "Tom?" she whispered, the name catching in her throat. Tom stood from the table, heart thudding against his ribs. "Stay here, all of you. Quiet," he murmured, his voice low and tight. Cautiously, he stepped toward the living room, peering into the gloom. In the shadows, a figure stood just at the threshold. A woman. She was deathly thin and tall, with long, stringy hair that obscured her face. Her dress hung off her gaunt frame, a filthy yellowed gown that might once have been white. Tom exhaled in relief for a half-second, thinking perhaps a lost traveler or a neighbor in trouble had wandered in until the woman's head twitched at an odd angle. There was something terribly wrong about the way she stood, as if her bones didn't fit together right. Maggie rose from her chair, gut twisting with dread. "Ma'am?" Tom said unsteadily. "Do you need?" Before he could finish, at the sound of Tom's voice, the woman moved. In a blink, she lunged out of the darkness, closing the 10 feet between them effortlessly. A pale hand flashed out and slammed into Tom's chest. He was thrown backward, as if hit by a speeding truck, crashing into the dining table. Plates and glasses exploded on the floor. Maggie screamed. Jake jumped to his feet and grabbed Emily, pulling his little sister protectively behind him. Tom sprawled amid the ruins of dinner, gasping for air. He was alive, thank God, but stunned, eyes wide in disbelief and pain. The strange woman stood over Tom. Her face was mostly hidden behind her tangled black hair, but Maggie saw a glint of teeth in a too-wide grin. The intruder's hands were curled into claws at her sides, fingernails black and sharpened. Tom managed to draw a shuddering breath. "Don't, look, ignore, if you can," he rasped, each word an effort. The woman cocked her head at Tom's whisper, emitting a low, animalistic hiss. Maggie understood instantly. This thing reacted violently when noticed or addressed. Tom speaking to her had triggered the attack. Heart hammering, Maggie inched toward her children, never taking her eyes off the floor near the woman's bare, dirty feet. Jake clutched Emily to his chest. The little girl was trembling, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she stayed silent. The woman's head swiveled toward Maggie. Maggie froze, keeping her gaze down. The stench of rot wafted off the figure, a suffocating odor of damp earth and decay. Maggie's stomach lurched, but she forced herself not to recoil or gag. "Don't give any sign. Don't see her." For a tense moment, the only sound was the wind outside and Maggie's thundering heartbeat. The entity took a halting step forward, testing them. When no one reacted, she began to glide around the table. Maggie risked a tiny sidelong glance. The woman moved with an eerie, jerky grace, her dirty gown whispering over the floorboards. She drifted behind Jake and Emily. Maggie's muscles tensed. The woman slowly raised one skeletal hand and hovered it just above Emily's golden hair, fingers splayed, as if she might seize a handful and rip the girl's scalp back. A faint whimper escaped Emily's throat. Maggie bit down hard on her lip until she tasted blood, fighting every instinct in her body, screaming to tackle the monster away from her daughter. Jake squeezed his sister tightly and squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look at the horror looming behind them. The woman's hand hung in the air for a few agonizing seconds. Then, finding no reaction from the terrified family, she let it drop. A frustrated hiss slipped from her lips, like steam from a kettle. She slid away from the children and circled toward Maggie. Maggie stood rigid, eyes cast downward. The filthy hem of the woman's dress swished past inches from Maggie's feet. Maggie could feel an unnatural chill radiating from her. The light above the table flickered as the figure passed beneath it, and Maggie prayed silently, "Please, please just leave." A sudden series of loud knocks on the front door shattered the tense silence. Maggie flinched before she could stop herself. The pale woman halted, head snapping toward the sound. "Hello, Tom? Maggie? Everything all right?" called a male voice from the porch. Maggie's heart sank. It was their neighbor, Bill Jennings. Of all times, Tom, still on the floor, sucked in a breath. Before Maggie could warn him, he croaked out, "Bill, no! Get out! Don't!" He had addressed Bill directly in the woman's presence. The entity let out an ear-splitting shriek. Faster than Maggie's eyes could follow, the pale figure surged into the foyer. The front door was cracked open now. Bill must have started to enter after hearing the commotion. He stood in the doorway, lantern in hand from crossing the dark yard, confusion and alarm on his face. The woman intercepted him before he fully understood the threat. She grabbed Bill by the throat with one hand and slammed the door shut with the other, cutting off the scant moonlight. Maggie stumbled toward the foyer, unable to let her friend be slaughtered without trying to intervene, but what she saw rooted her to the spot. Bill was a burly, middle-aged man, but in the entity's grip, he was helpless. The woman hoisted him off the floor by his neck. Bill's legs kicked wildly, knocking over a small table by the door. He gurgled, trying to scream. With a guttural snarl, the figure drove Bill backward. A row of heavy coat hooks jutted from the wall. One punctured straight through Bill's open mouth and cheek with a sickening crunch. Bill's boots drummed against the wall as he struggled, impaled and choking on his own blood. Maggie clapped a hand over her mouth, choking back a cry of horror. Jake and Emily pressed themselves into a corner of the dining room, eyes tightly shut, but there was no blocking out the wet gargling noises and the smell of blood. The intruder wasn't done. She tore Bill off the hook with a horrific wrenching sound, ripping open the side of his face. Bill collapsed to the floor. The woman crouched over him and with one swipe of her claws, opened his throat. The lantern Bill had carried flickered on the floor, illuminating the spray of blood that now coated the entryway. In seconds, Bill Jennings was dead. Maggie's vision swam. She thought she might faint or vomit, maybe both. Somehow she remained standing for Jake and Emily's sake. The children were sobbing soundlessly, clinging to each other behind her. The figure rose from Bill's mutilated body. In the dancing lantern light, Maggie could see more of the woman's face beneath the stringy hair. The skin was ashen and shriveled, stretched over cheekbones and peeling away in places. And her eyes, Maggie's breath caught. Her eyes shone a vivid, hungry green. Those eyes fixed on Maggie now, glinting with twisted satisfaction. The woman stepped back into the dining room, tracking bloody footprints across Maggie's rug. She moved unhurriedly, as though sated for the moment. To Maggie's astonishment, the pale woman pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the chair where Tom usually sat, and calmly took a seat. She folded her bony hands in her lap and became still, like a grotesque parody of a dinner guest. Maggie did not dare move. She stood trembling, trying not to meet that emerald gaze boring into her. The only sound was the wind moaning outside and the soft drip of blood from Bill's corpse in the hall. Minutes stretched by. Maggie's legs felt ready to give out beneath her, but she locked her knees. Jake, still shielding Emily, had slid down to sit on the floor against the wall. He looked at Maggie, eyes asking, "What do we do?" Maggie had no answer. Tom lay only a few yards away, unconscious or worse, and she had no idea how to help him without drawing the woman's wrath again. Little Emily let out a tiny sob. "Daddy," she whimpered almost inaudibly, her face buried against Jake's shirt. Maggie's heart cracked at the sound. She wanted nothing more than to rush to Tom's side herself, but the entity still sat watching, listening. The thing's head cocked at the child's cry. A grin tugged at the corner of her blood-smeared mouth, as if she took pleasure in their misery. Maggie's sorrow turned to anger, flaring hot in her chest. How dare this monster come into their home? Maggie clenched her jaw, fighting to remain outwardly impassive. Ignore it. Survive. But if an opportunity came to get her children out alive, she was damn well going to take it. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was moving closer. As if on cue, the dining room lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Emily cried out in fear when the lights died. Maggie reached behind her, feeling for her children, and found Jake's hand. "I'm here," she breathed, the words barely a whisper against the storm. After a few seconds, the electricity sputtered back. The overhead light returned, weak and buzzing. Maggie blinked in the harsh light and saw that the chair at the head of the table was empty. The woman was gone. Maggie's breath caught. She darted a glance around, trying to spot the intruder without actually looking directly for her. A faint scratch, scratch, scratch sound came from above. Jake followed her gaze upward and screamed, "Mom, up there, look!" Maggie's head snapped up despite herself. Her blood ran cold. The woman was clinging to the high corner of the dining room ceiling, pressed flat against the wall like a gigantic pale spider. Her neck was twisted at an impossible angle, face turned toward the family below. Those green eyes blazed with feral joy at being seen. Emily's resolve shattered. The little girl let out a shriek of pure terror. That was all the invitation the entity needed. With a horrific skittering motion, the woman scurried across the ceiling and then dropped onto the dining table, landing in a crouch amid the broken dishes. She sprang towards the children, fingers outstretched to grab. Maggie hurled herself into the figure's path. "Run! Jake! Take her!" she screamed. She shoved Emily out of the way, straight into Jake's arms. Jake didn't hesitate. He dragged his sister toward the kitchen and the back door, half carrying her as she sobbed. The intruder's clawed hand closed on Maggie's forearm with crushing force. Maggie cried out as icy pain lanced up to her shoulder. The woman yanked Maggie, tossing her across the room. Maggie slammed against the kitchen doorway and collapsed to the floor, head ringing. Dazed, she watched as Jake got the back door open. Wind and rain burst into the kitchen. Jake pushed Emily outside. "Go! Hide in the car! Lock it!" he shouted to his sister over the storm's roar. Emily disappeared into the rainy night. Jake turned back, hesitating on the threshold. He couldn't bring himself to leave Maggie behind. The entity noticed. She vaulted off the table and barreled into the kitchen, intent on the boy. Maggie's vision swam, but she forced herself onto her hands and knees. "Jake, get out, now!" she screamed, raw terror ripping through her. The teenager finally obeyed, slipping out into the dark after his sister. As he pulled the door shut, he slammed it hard and threw the deadbolt. Click. The sound was swallowed by the storm. The lock engaged. Maggie tried to rise, but the pale woman was on her in an instant. A clawed hand tangled in Maggie's hair, jerking her head back. Maggie bit down a scream as she felt strands ripping from her scalp. The woman's other hand came around, sharp nails glinting, aiming for Maggie's throat. Boom! A gunshot exploded from the hallway. The entity's torso jerked as a spray of black, tar-like ichor burst from her chest. The woman screeched, releasing Maggie and reeling backward. Tom stood at the mouth of the hallway, bloodied and swaying but conscious. He had dragged himself up and retrieved the old shotgun from the hall closet. Smoke curled from the barrel. His face was ghastly pale, but he racked the shotgun to load the second barrel, stepping fully into the kitchen. "Get away from my wife!" Tom growled and fired again. The blast caught the figure in the shoulder, nearly severing her right arm. She howled, a sound of primordial rage and pain. The woman's eyes, blazing with hatred, fixed on Tom. In a blur, she rushed him. Tom couldn't reload fast enough. She crashed into him, and they both tumbled to the floor. Maggie screamed as the entity drove her claws into Tom's chest. Tom let out a strangled cry, blood bubbling on his lips. Summoning a last reserve of strength, Tom jammed the shotgun's muzzle up under the woman's chin and pulled the trigger one final time. The click of an empty chamber echoed. He was out of shells. The woman's ruined mouth twisted into something like a victorious snarl. She opened her jaws wide, preparing to tear out Tom's throat. Maggie snatched up the cast-iron skillet that had fallen nearby. With a wordless roar, she swung it at the back of the woman's skull with all her might. The heavy pan connected with a sickening crunch. The intruder lurched forward, nearly collapsing onto Tom. Maggie hit her again and again, hammering until the figure finally released her husband and slumped over, motionless. A sudden silence fell, broken only by Maggie's ragged sobs. The woman's body crumpled on linoleum, her face shattered, and one glassy green eye staring sightlessly. As Maggie watched, that last eye dimmed. The woman's form began to dissolve, melting into shadow and puddles of inky black fluid. Maggie dropped the skillet with a clang and fell to her knees beside Tom. He was on his back, gasping wetly. Blood stained his chest and the floor under him. Maggie cradled his head in her lap. "Tom," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain blowing in from outside. "Hold on. Please hold on. The kids, they're safe. You're going to be okay." She knew she was lying, and so did he. Tom's eyes fluttered open. He reached a trembling hand up to touch Maggie's face. "Love, you," he breathed. His fingers went slack and fell away as his eyes slid shut. Maggie pressed her forehead to his, a keening moan escaping her. He was gone. He'd sacrificed himself to save them. Outside, sirens wailed, drawing closer. Neighbors or the kids must have called for help. The nightmare was ending. Maggie forced herself up and staggered through the rain to the car parked in the muddy driveway. Jake and Emily were huddled in the back seat, drenched and shivering but alive. Maggie yanked the door open and pulled them into her arms. They clung to her, all three of them crying in relief and heartbreak. "Mom? Dad?" Emily choked out against Maggie's shoulder. "Ramel, shh, baby, shh. It's over. I've got you," Maggie murmured, holding them tighter as red and blue lights flashed at the end of their lane. The first police cruiser swerved in. It was finally over. Later, officials would struggle to make sense of the bloodbath in the Harper home. Maggie herself could hardly believe what had happened, but as the sky lightened with approaching dawn, one thing was certain. An evil beyond understanding had visited them, and only by refusing to acknowledge it had any of them survived. The memory of that woman, her lipless grin and vengeful eyes, would haunt their dreams, but she was gone. And the Harpers, what remained of them, would never forget the lesson learned in terror. When something monstrous knocks at your door, sometimes the hardest but only thing you can do is to ignore it completely, no matter how much it demands your attention. If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.